Hello, my name is Josef Spjut, and I'm a research scientist in the New Experiences Research Group at NVIDIA. I'd like to talk to you today about how we've come to think about foveated displays and one way they might be classified. The first thing we need to do before we can begin to classify foveated displays is to know what they are. In preparing this talk, I did a quick Google search and grabbed a couple quotes I found from others. The first quote here indicates that a foveated display should be one that moves to where the user is looking. This second quote says that a foveated display should have a different pixel density for different parts of the display. What we've tried to do with our paper is create a classification system for foveated displays that accepts both of these definitions. As an aside, in my research group at NVIDIA, I've found that depending who you ask, either of these definitions might be most natural, and sometimes even more interpretations exist. I've come to understand that the definition of foveated display is largely in the eye of the beholder and depends where they're coming from. Quite literally, the term foveated comes from two roots. One is the fovea, which is the pitted region of the eye that happens to have the highest visual acuity. The second is the verb foveate, which is the action a person takes when they angle their eye at something, which places the light from that thing in the fovea. Obviously, these are related. In this talk, I'm mostly going to talk about HMDs, head-mounted displays, but we tried to present an approach that is still fairly relevant for other kinds of displays on desktops and laptops. To give you an example of the kind of foveation I'm talking about, this is a photo I took at the zoo that I edited with photo editing software to demonstrate foveation when the expected gaze location is the parrot. The idea is that the periphery can be lower resolution, shown here with a simple blur, while the foveal resolution of the display needs to be high resolution to line up with the human visual system. To add reasons why we might want to use foveated displays in imaging, it's worth talking about the anticipated benefits of wider deployment of this technology. First, when done correctly and integrated across the computing system, foveation allows a reduction in raw pixel count, which reduces rendering and compute power required to achieve the visual experience. This reduction in compute requirements also provides similar benefits in terms of increased battery life and reduced power output. These improvements also cascade to improve the form factor of devices by reducing the size needed for spreading out heat and also increase the potential operating lifetime. Now that we understand what foveated displays are and some of the benefits that might come from them, what are the objectives of this classification system we're proposing? First, we want to create meaningful divisions of the possible design space. We also want something easy for a user to classify in a busy exhibition hall when only given a few minutes to evaluate a display. I also want to make it clear that the proposal I'm describing here is not meant to be absolute truth or a universal classification that will solve all of the problems in classifying these foveated display designs. Instead, I intend for this proposal to elicit discussion from the relevant companies and researchers and hope that over the coming years we might arrive at some consensus. The human visual system has a visual acuity driven by the number of rods and cones as well as ganglion cells and other parts, including the brain. When you look into this, you'll find figures that show that visual acuity is highest in the center of vision and falls off toward the periphery. While it's extremely valuable to continue to strive to understand the human visual system at deeper and deeper levels, for the sake of this discussion, we're going to establish an approximation of the human visual acuity distribution function, or ADF, which is a monotonically decreasing function from the center of human vision. Furthermore, we'll compare that ADF, the dashed purple line here, with the resolution distribution, or RDF, of the display, hardware, and optics, the solid blue line. Convenient to this discussion, we can think of a central region that maintains approximately the same high resolution as the fovea of the display, and the part outside the high resolution can be considered the periphery. To help you understand the chart, this x-axis is the visual eccentricity, which means that the center of gaze is at 0 on the x-axis, and the resolution in cycles per degree falls off as it moves to the periphery. Nominal human vision is indicated by 2020 in the Snellen chart, and is usually thought of as achieving 30 cycles per degree, or CPD, at the center of vision. The RDF is only defined for an instantaneous gaze direction, since any change in gaze has the potential to move the origin. Thus, the concept of gaze contingence becomes essential, which is the degree to which the gaze is capable of responding with a consistent RDF as the gaze shifts, or the user foveates. Gaze contingence can be accomplished in a number of ways, and our focus in this classification is not necessarily on the implementation itself, but rather the results of the underlying implementation. In fact, both RDF and gaze contingence will describe as the experience seen by the user. In the RDF axis, the classifications we came up with should be relatively straightforward to identify as a user with the given visual acuity. The highest classification type is A, which indicates that the display's RDF meets or exceeds the human visual ADF, the human's ADF for the entire field of view. Types B and C meet or exceed the ADF for the entire fovea or periphery respectively, either of which may be preferred depending on the application. Finally, the RDF for type D falls below the ADF in both the fovea and the periphery. In the figures on the right, we've given examples of a two-tiered display that would land in each of these classifications. Green regions indicate eccentricities for which the ADF was met, while red regions indicate the RDF was not sufficient to meet the ADF. While some green area may be needed to blend between different display resolutions, it's worth noting that significant green area represents waste or inefficiency, since the human may not see the additional pixels present in the display. Since a user's visual acuity, or Snellen ratio, is directly related to their ability to perceive the display's RDF, it should be reported alongside the classification. Thus, a 2040 user might consider a display type A, while a 2020 user could arrive at a type C designation if the display doesn't quite reach 2020 in the fovea. Since relatively few HMDs on the market today actually support 2020 visual acuity, except sometimes in the periphery, many existing HMD designs are actually type C or D. A few notes on the ADF we're using here. Instead of just using rod and cone density or the ganglion cell density, we opted to base our ADF approximation on perceptual data for more time in Anstis. Furthermore, we ignore the blind spot, assume radial symmetry, and propose a couple possible functions. There's more details in the paper, but improving the approximate ADF is an area that could use more data and future work. The second axis of classification is gaze contingence, which we define as the range of eye motion over which the display is able to maintain a consistent RDF. We give the highest designation, class 1, to displays which support the full range of motion possible by the human eye, and establish class 2 as what we consider to be a reasonably good range of eye motion to support the majority of human uses. While the human eye does exceed plus or minus 15 degrees at times, a large number of practical uses can be covered by display motion in that range. Our class 3 designation we believe to be useful for displays intended for niche applications, where a narrow range of motion is all that is needed. Finally, class 4 displays capture the rest of displays, and are displays which may be intended to be looked at in a single general gaze direction. A single informational display with a very narrow field of view would be an example of this kind of display design being good. Now that we've defined our terms, we can lay these two axes out in a grid, which will allow us to place any foveated display in that space. Letters indicating how well the RDF matches the ADF, and numbers indicating how well the display responds to changing gaze. Here I've dropped a red X to show the ideal foveated display for every use. Note that I've labeled this 2020 to indicate that this assumes nominal human visual acuity. I'll use this chart to show the classification of a few commercial and research prototypes in the next few slides. With a large number of displays on the market and certain to be released over the years, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of every display out there. We've classified most of the first generation of VR HMDs as Class D4 because they lack gaze contingence without being paired with a foveated rendering algorithm and do not match 2020 visual acuity except perhaps in the extreme periphery. For some of the recent second generation VR HMDs, we've given them Class C4 because they once again do not have any gaze contingence. However, due to the increased resolution, we consider them to generally match in the periphery for at least the central gaze angle. Varjo, which released the first commercial foveated display, embeds a high resolution inset alongside fairly standard wide field of view periphery. At least publicly, they have not yet shown movement to respond to users' gaze. Thus, we give them the classification A4. I also put the light orange X in C3 because if you accept some peripheral artifacts, then the gaze can move with a narrow range inside the foveal inset display. I believe this is the intended usage pattern of Varjo's product. It's worth also noting that they have added gaze contingent rendering to their pipeline in the recent months. Finally, some research from our lab, presented at SIGGRAPH 2019, demonstrates the first publicly shown gaze contingent hardware. This solution we consider Class B2 because it is gaze contingent, but only over around 15 degrees of eye motion, and the periphery will occasionally have noticeable artifacts. Feel free to read that paper if you'd like more details about this design. There's a bunch of other discussion in the paper about a variety of related topics, but given time constraints, I won't go into all of this in the talk. Please take a look at that paper if you want to read more. It's worth noting that future foveated display taxonomies may be strengthened by directly including some of these issues in the way they classify displays. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions you might have. If you're not watching this talk at the conference, Twitter is a great way to reach me. Thank you.